Every painting you've ever seen of Jesus is wrong. Every stained glass window. Every Sunday school illustration. Every Hollywood movie. Every Renaissance masterpiece hanging in museums across Europe. They're all wrong. For 2,000 years, artists have painted Jesus with pale skin, flowing brown hair, blue eyes, and a perfectly groomed beard. He looks European. Gentle. Almost feminine in some paintings. But here's the truth. Jesus of Nazareth didn't look anything like that. He wasn't pale. He wasn't European. And he definitely didn't have blue eyes. Jesus was a first-century Jewish man from the Middle East. He was a working-class carpenter who spent most of his time outdoors in the brutal Palestinian sun. And thanks to modern science, forensic anthropology, and historical research, we now have a pretty good idea of what he actually looked like. The real Jesus would shock most people. He wouldn't fit in a single one of those beautiful paintings. Today we're going to explore what Jesus of Nazareth really looked like. Not the Jesus of European art and imagination, but the historical Jesus. The Jewish carpenter from Galilee. And once you see him the way he actually was, you'll never look at those paintings the same way again. Let's find out what Jesus really looked like. Before we can talk about what Jesus looked like, we need to understand where the traditional image came from. Why do we picture Jesus as a pale, long-haired European man? The answer is simple. Because that's how European artists painted him. And European art dominated Christianity for over 1,000 years. In the early centuries of Christianity, there were very few images of Jesus at all. The earliest Christians, many of whom were Jewish, followed the commandment against making graven images. They didn't create portraits or statues of Jesus. The first Christian art was symbolic. Fish. Crosses. The Good Shepherd. Abstract representations, not realistic portraits. But as Christianity spread into the Roman Empire and eventually became the official religion of Rome, that changed. Artists began painting Jesus. And they painted him to look like themselves. In Rome, Jesus looked Roman. Toga. Short hair. Clean-shaven, like a Roman senator. In Byzantine Constantinople, Jesus looked Greek. Dark hair. Beard. Solemn expression. The Pantocrator, the ruler of all. But the image that really stuck, the one we all know today, came from the European Renaissance. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael painted Jesus as a European man. Pale skin. Long flowing hair. Soft features. Blue or green eyes. Why? Because they were painting for European audiences. For Italian patrons. For churches in France, Germany, England, Spain. They painted Jesus in a way that would resonate with the people who saw the paintings. And it worked. Those images became iconic. They spread across the world as European missionaries carried Christianity to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Soon, everyone everywhere pictured Jesus the same way. As a European. But there's a problem. Jesus wasn't European. He was Jewish. From the Middle East. From a region that's now Israel and Palestine. And people from that region, in the 1st century, looked very different from Renaissance Europeans. So what did they actually look like? To understand what Jesus looked like, we need to understand what 1st century Jews in Galilee looked like. And for that, we turn to science. In the early 2000s, a team of medical artists and forensic anthropologists, led by a British expert named Richard Neve, set out to create a historically accurate reconstruction of what a typical Jewish man from Jesus' time and place would have looked like. They didn't use the Gospels. They didn't use religious tradition. They used science. They started with skulls. Not Jesus' skull, obviously. That's never been found. But skulls of Jewish men from 1st century Palestine, discovered by archaeologists in the region. Using these skulls, the team applied forensic techniques used in modern criminal investigations. They measured bone structure, analyzed facial proportions, built up layers of muscle and tissue based on anatomical markers. They studied the climate. The geography. The typical occupation of men in that region. And they created a face. The result. A dark-skinned man with a broad face, dark eyes, short dark hair, and a thick beard. He looks Middle Eastern. Because he was. His skin is olive to brown, darkened by years of working outdoors under the intense Middle Eastern sun. His hair is short and curly, not long and flowing. Jewish men in that era typically kept their hair short, especially working men. His face is broad and weathered. This isn't the delicate, almost fragile face of Renaissance paintings. This is the face of a man who worked with his hands, who walked everywhere, who spent his days in the heat. His build would have been strong. Not muscular like a bodybuilder, but sturdy. Carpenters didn't sit at desks. They lifted heavy beams, shaped wood, worked with stone. Jesus would have looked like a laborer. Because he was. This reconstruction shocked a lot of people when it was first published. Because it looked nothing like the Jesus they'd grown up with. But here's the thing. This is almost certainly closer to the truth than any painting in any museum. Let's go deeper. Let's look at specific features. Skin color. Jesus was not pale. He was not white in the way Europeans are white. He was a Jew from Galilee, a region in the northern part of ancient Israel. The people there were Semitic, related to other Middle Eastern populations. Modern Jews from Europe, the Ashkenazi Jews, are often pale because they've lived in Europe for centuries and have intermarried with European populations. But ancient Jews in the Middle East would have had darker skin. Think of modern Palestinians, Syrians, Lebanese, Jordanians. That's the genetic and geographic population Jesus came from. Add to that the fact that Jesus spent most of his life working outdoors. Carpentry wasn't an indoor job. He would have been in the sun constantly. His skin would have been dark, tanned, weathered. Not the porcelain complexion of a Da Vinci painting. Hair. The traditional image shows Jesus with long, flowing hair, often light brown or even reddish. But Jewish men in first-century Palestine didn't typically wear their hair long. In fact, the Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians, said, "Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him?" Paul was a Jew. He was reflecting the cultural norms of his time. Long hair on men was considered shameful in Jewish culture. There were exceptions. Nazarites, men who took a special vow, didn't cut their hair. Samson was a Nazarite. John the Baptist might have been. But Jesus wasn't a Nazarite. He drank wine. He touched dead bodies. He didn't follow the Nazarite restrictions. So he almost certainly had short hair. And it would have been dark. Black or very dark brown. And curly or wavy, which is typical of Semitic populations. Not the straight, flowing locks of European art. Eyes. Blue-eyed Jesus is a staple of Western religious art. But blue eyes are a European trait. They're caused by a genetic mutation that's common in Northern Europe, but extremely rare in the Middle East. Jesus would have had dark eyes. Brown. Deep brown, almost black. That's what the vast majority of people in that region have. It's what Jews from the Middle East have today. Blue eyes on Jesus? Pure fantasy. Beard. Here, the traditional art actually gets something right. Jesus probably did have a beard. Jewish men in the 1st century commonly wore beards. It was part of their cultural and religious identity. The Torah has prohibitions against shaving the corners of the beard, which many Jewish men interpreted as a command to keep a full beard. But Jesus' beard wouldn't have been long and perfectly groomed like in the paintings. It would have been a short to medium-length beard. Thick. Dark. Practical. Not styled. Not flowing. Just a working man's beard. Height and build. The Gospels never tell us how tall Jesus was. But we can make an educated guess based on the average height of men in that time and region. Archaeological evidence suggests that the average Jewish man in 1st century Palestine was about 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 5 inches tall. By modern Western standards, that's short. But it was normal for the time. Jesus was probably somewhere in that range. Average height for his time, which means short by our standards. As for build, he was a carpenter. A tekton in Greek, which could mean carpenter, builder, or stonemason. This wasn't light work. He would have been cutting wood, shaping beams, possibly working with stone, carrying materials, building. His body would have been lean and strong, muscular in a functional way, not a gym way. Hands calloused, skin rough, body hardened by years of physical labor. Jesus was a working-class man. He looked like it. Now, some people object to all of this. They say, but Jesus was special. He was the Son of God. Maybe he looked different. And here's the thing. The Gospels actually argue against that. Isaiah, prophesying about the Messiah hundreds of years before Jesus, wrote, "He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him." In other words, the Messiah wouldn't stand out because of his looks. He'd be ordinary, average. And that fits with what we know about Jesus' life. When Jesus taught in his hometown of Nazareth, the people were shocked. They said, "Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son?" They knew him. He'd grown up there. He looked like one of them. If Jesus had looked dramatically different, pale skin, blue eyes, striking appearance, people would have commented on it. The Gospels would have mentioned it. But they don't. Because Jesus looked like a typical Jewish man from Galilee. He blended in. That's actually theologically important. The whole point of the incarnation is that God became fully human, not a superhuman. Not a divine being wearing a human costume. Fully human. And part of being fully human is looking human. Looking like the people around you. Jesus was Jewish. He looked Jewish. He was Middle Eastern. He looked Middle Eastern. He was a carpenter. He looked like a carpenter. There was nothing in his appearance that marked him as special. His identity as the Son of God was revealed through his words, his works, his resurrection, not through his appearance. So if Jesus didn't look like the paintings, why do we keep painting him that way? Part of it is tradition. The European image of Jesus is so deeply embedded in Christian culture that changing it feels wrong to a lot of people. Part of it is comfort. People have an emotional attachment to the Jesus they grew up with. The Jesus in the paintings. Changing that image can feel like losing something sacred. But there's something deeper going on. Throughout history, every culture has depicted Jesus in a way that reflects their own image. In Ethiopia, Jesus is painted as black, with African features. In China, Jesus appears in art with Asian features. In Mexico, Jesus often looks mestizo, mixed indigenous and Spanish heritage. This isn't necessarily wrong. It's a way for people to connect with Jesus, to see him as one of them. The problem comes when one culture's image of Jesus is presented as the only correct image. When European Jesus becomes universal Jesus. When a pale blue-eyed European man is held up as the definitive portrait of the Son of God. Because that's not just inaccurate. It's harmful. It suggests that Jesus was European. That Christianity is a European religion. That God looks European. And that has been used, throughout history, to justify colonialism, racism, and the idea that European culture is superior to all others. The real Jesus challenges that. The real Jesus was a brown-skinned Jewish man from the Middle East. He was born into an oppressed minority under Roman occupation. He was a refugee as a baby, fleeing political violence. He lived in a multicultural region, influenced by Jewish, Greek, and Roman cultures. He didn't fit into our modern racial categories. He wasn't white. He wasn't black. He was Semitic, Middle Eastern. And recognizing that matters. Because it reminds us that Jesus came for all people. Not just Europeans. Not just one race or culture. He came as a specific person, in a specific time and place. But his message was universal. And part of that universality is recognizing that he doesn't belong to any one culture. Not to Europe. Not to America. Not to anyone. Jesus was Jewish. And he belongs to the world. Let's talk about some specific details that help us understand what Jesus looked like. Clothing. Jesus didn't wear the flowing white robes we see in paintings. Those are Roman togas or generic ancient costumes invented by artists. Jesus would have worn typical Jewish clothing of his time. A tunic. A simple, knee-length or ankle-length garment made of wool or linen. Probably undyed or a natural tan color. Maybe striped, which was common. Over that, a cloak or outer robe. This would have been heavier, used for warmth at night or protection from the sun during the day. He would have worn a head covering. Jewish men often wore a cloth wrapped around the head, both for sun protection and as a sign of modesty and respect. On his feet, sandals. Simple leather sandals. The kind that left his feet dusty and dirty from walking on unpaved roads. Around his waist, a belt or sash. Practical, for holding the tunic in place and carrying small items. His clothing would have been practical. Durable. Probably worn and patched from years of use. He wasn't fashion conscious. He was a working man who owned maybe 2 or 3 outfits total. Hands and feet. Jesus' hands would have been rough. Calloused from years of working with wood and stone. Scarred, probably. Fingers strong and weathered. Not the soft, delicate hands of Renaissance paintings. His feet would have been tough. Sandals don't offer much protection. His feet would have been dusty, calloused, maybe scarred from walking miles every day on rough terrain. This is the Jesus who washed his disciples' feet. He knew what dirty, tired feet felt like. Because his own were the same. Voice. We don't know what Jesus' voice sounded like. But we can make some guesses. He spoke Aramaic, the common language of Jews in 1st century Palestine. He probably also knew some Hebrew, for reading scripture. And possibly some Greek, which was the trade language of the Roman Empire. His accent would have been Galilean. People from Jerusalem could tell he was from Galilee just by the way he spoke. We know this because when Peter was questioned after Jesus' arrest, people said, "Your accent gives you away. You're one of them." Jesus probably had a strong, clear voice. He taught outdoors, often to large crowds. No microphones. He had to project. But his tone. Probably warm. Authoritative when he needed to be. Gentle with children and the hurting. Sharp with hypocrites. Not the soft, whispery voice we often hear in movies. Demeanor. Jesus was approachable. The Gospels show children running to him. Prostitutes and tax collectors feeling comfortable eating with him. Crowds pressing close to touch him. He wasn't intimidating or distant. But he was also intense. He drove money changers out of the temple with a whip. He called the Pharisees snakes and whitewashed tombs. He wept openly. He was fully human. Emotional. Real. Not serene and detached like in so many paintings. Here's why all of this matters. Understanding what Jesus really looked like changes how we read the Gospels. When Jesus walked through Samaria and talked to a woman at a well, he looked like her. Same region. Same general appearance. When he was in a crowd, he blended in. That's why Judas had to identify him with a kiss. The soldiers couldn't pick him out by sight. When he was crucified between 2 thieves, and people mocked him, they weren't mocking someone who looked different. They were mocking one of their own. When Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to Mary in the garden, she thought he was the gardener. Because he looked like a gardener. A working man. Jesus' ordinariness is part of the story. God didn't come to earth as a king in a palace. He came as a carpenter in a backwater village. He didn't look special. He looked like everyone else. And that's the point. The incarnation is about God entering into the fullness of human experience. Not as a superhuman, but as a regular person. A brown-skinned Jewish carpenter from Nazareth. That's who Jesus was. And that's who we should picture when we read about him. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Does it matter what Jesus looked like? Some people say no. They say it's his message that matters, not his appearance. And they're partially right. Jesus' teachings, his death, his resurrection, those are what save us. Not what he looked like. But representation matters. When every image of Jesus is European, it sends a message. It says that God looks European. That Christianity is a white religion. That Jesus belongs to one group of people. And that's simply not true. Jesus was a Jewish man from the Middle East. Recognizing that is part of honoring the historical truth of the Incarnation. It also opens Christianity up to the whole world. When people in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East see a Jesus who looks European, it can feel like Christianity is a foreign religion. A colonial import. But when they see a Jesus who looks Middle Eastern, who came from a region not so different from their own, who lived under foreign occupation, who experienced poverty and oppression, it changes things. They can see themselves in his story. And that's powerful. Jesus came for everyone. And everyone should be able to see themselves in him. Not because we change his appearance to match ours, but because we recognize his true appearance and see that he was never European to begin with. He was Middle Eastern. And his message was for the world. Let's bring this home. The next time you see a painting of Jesus with pale skin, blue eyes, and flowing hair, remember it's art. Beautiful art, in many cases. Art that has inspired millions of people for centuries. But it's not history. The real Jesus, the historical Jesus, looked different. He had dark skin, tanned by the Palestinian sun. He had dark eyes and short, curly hair. He had a thick beard and calloused hands. He was about 5'3", with the strong build of a working man. He wore simple clothing, walked in dusty sandals, and spoke with a Galilean accent. He looked like a Jewish carpenter from 1st century Nazareth. Because that's exactly what he was. And that's beautiful. Not because there's anything wrong with European art or European culture, but because the real Jesus is so much more interesting than the paintings. He's real. Historical. Rooted in a specific time and place. He's not a generic, timeless figure. He's a particular person who lived a particular life. And when we see him that way, when we picture him accurately, something changes. We stop making him in our image. And we start seeing him as he was. A Jewish man. A Middle Eastern man. A working class man. A man who experienced what billions of people around the world experience. Poverty. Oppression. Hard work. Dusty feet. A man who looked like the people he came to save. Because he was one of them. And he's one of us too. Not because he looks like us, whatever we look like, but because he became fully human. And that's the miracle. Not that God looked beautiful or striking or special, but that God looked ordinary. God looked like a carpenter from Nazareth. And in doing so, God showed us that every human being, regardless of what they look like, is made in his image. The real Jesus challenges our assumptions about what God looks like, about who God came for, about what matters. And maybe that's exactly what we need. Not a Jesus who fits comfortably into our cultural expectations, but a Jesus who surprises us. A Jesus who reminds us that God's ways are not our ways. A Jesus who looked nothing like the paintings, and everything like the people he came to save. That's the real Jesus. And once you see him that way, you'll never unsee it. Every painting will look different. Every statue will feel incomplete. Because you'll know the truth. Jesus wasn't European. He was Jewish. Middle Eastern. A brown-skinned carpenter from Galilee. And that's exactly who the world needed him to be. Not a distant, untouchable figure, but one of us. Fully human. Fully God. And absolutely, beautifully real.